Welcome to the second episode in a three-part Legendarium series about New England's vampire scare. In Part 2, Demons in the Graveyard, we will learn more about the 19th century New England vampire scare and how vampire lore became something of an alternate religion in the region. Going into the 19th century, a full-scale vampire panic began sweeping New England as people sought to explain the periodic epidemics of tuberculosis which scythed the population. They began performing exhumations and rituals across the region to stop the dead from supposedly rising. Since disease and superstition do not stop at national borders, the vampire rituals spread from New England into the St. Lawrence River Valley of Canada. Most of these vampire exhumations took place in remote rural villages. For these frightened and superstitious people, vampires did not appear as alluring or romantic figures, but their own loved ones possessed by demons. Curiously, the people who performed these ritualized exhumations rarely referred to the exhumed corpses as vampires. Only outsiders, like newspaper writers and local historians, sometimes referred to the consumption rituals as vampirism. Such grave-digging scenes played out 80 times throughout 19th century New England. Many hundreds more likely took place but went undocumented. In many cases, only family and neighbors participated in these grisly nighttime events. Yet, in some cases, town fathers voted on the matter, or medical doctors and clergymen gave their blessings to the exhumations. Sometimes they even pitched in with the digging and mutilation. Some communities in Maine and Plymouth, Massachusetts, opted simply to flip the exhumed vampire face down in the grave and leave it at that. However, some Vermont towns took things a step further, burning organs for hundreds of witnesses to see. Vermont's highly public ceremonies perhaps took their form because villages there tended to have large cemeteries in the middle of town that made secret ceremonies impossible. One 1830 heart-burning ceremony in Woodstock, Vermont, drew hundreds of people to the village green. Victims of tuberculosis would inhale the resultant smoke of vampire heart-burnings in the belief it would cure them of their terrible illness. Another old-time remedy advised them to cut out the heart and liver of suspected vampires, burn them on a rock, and mix the ashes with water. Tuberculosis victims would then drink the magic potion in the hope of curing themselves and making sure that the vampire remained dead this time. Young people dying from tuberculosis often became terrified that they would turn into vampires after their death. In one documented case, a young woman who knew that she would soon die of tuberculosis begged her parents to promise her that after she died, they would remove her heart and make it into a potion that they would give to her sisters. Her parents, deeply imbibed in the community's lore, agreed and carried out her wishes after her death. Incredulous city reporters wrote excitedly about the horrible superstition, as they called it, on front pages. A traveling minister described an exhumation in his daily log on September 3rd, 1810. He described it as a moldy spectacle and a solemn sight. Even literary great Henry David Thoreau mentioned an exhumation in his journal on September 29, 1859. 5 years earlier, another exhumation took place not far from Thoreau's home. A man simply named on his grave as J.B. died in his 50s during the 1830s in Jewett City, Connecticut. In 1854, townspeople in Jewett City began exhuming corpses suspected to be vampires rising from their graves. The people proceeded to wholly rearrange JB's now skeletal remains. They chopped off his head and then placed his skull and thigh bones atop the vertebrae. Villagers also smashed JB's ribs while searching for his heart so they could use it in a ceremony to end the vampire's supposedly unnatural life. They rearranged his bones into a skull and crossbones motif, like that of a Jolly Roger. The villagers then smashed the coffin and hammered in the initials JB into the coffin using brass tacks, which is how we know his name. It is important to note that people outside these small and remote towns regarded the vampire rituals with horror. In the wake of the JB exhumation, a small-town Connecticut newspaper opined, "We seem to have been transported back to the darkest age of unreasoning ignorance and blind superstition instead of living in the 19th century and in a state calling itself enlightened and Christian." When will the New England vampire panic finally end? We will find out in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this installment of the Legendarium. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.